Welcome to OLC 4.0, Term 2A. This is class number 6, assignment number 8, and we're going to be looking at punctuation today as well. Here is the contact page. You can reach me by email at jillian.percy@nnecschools.org. You can contact me by Facebook with G. Percy Wassa. You can also find stuff on YouTube at G. Percy Wassa. And you can, let me see here, call the studio 1-800-465-7144. And student work can be submitted at studentwork@nnec.on.ca. Please always include your full name, course name, assignment name, and number. If the assignment asks for both a rough and a good copy, please label which is which and include them both in the same email. Okay, today's work, understanding what dashes mean when we read, understanding how to use dashes in your writing, understanding the meaning and usage of colons, understanding the meaning and usage of semicolons. Be sure to read chapter 1 in order to do today's assignments. Assignment 18 is writing down our thoughts on chapter 1 using 3 of 13 possible prompts. This assignment looks quite simple, but they pack a lot of different concepts into this one, so we're going to look at it in depth, okay? How to make connections to what we read, how to identify message or theme, how to identify bias or missing point of view, and how to identify the main ideas or important content. Okay, we're starting with punctuation. How can we use dashes within a sentence? There's 3 main ways. You can use it to define a word. So for example, reconciliation, dash, the restoring of friendly relationships is not possible unless truth is a part of that relationship. You can also use it to provide a further explanation or summary of material that comes before the dash. He hated history, science, English, dash, every topic that needed reading, dash, every new school year. You can also use it to introduce a short list within a sentence. His mom had bought everything, pencil, eraser, bindle, and pencil case, dash, in a neon green color that he loved. Now, you wouldn't use it for a long list because it would get too unwieldy, but it will work for a short list. Oh, and we did this already. Here, it's being used as a definition. Here, it's a short list about the different businesses that he's attempted. Here, it's a different short list about the kinds of items you need in order to make some cookies. Okay, colons and semicolons. How do we use colons in our writing? A colon can be used for multiple reasons: to give emphasis, to present dialogue, to introduce lists or text, and to clarify composition or like book titles. So emphasis, here are some examples. He had only one goal, colon, the destruction of his enemies. It was her favorite enemy, colon, Christmas. The sound had haunted him throughout his dreams, colon, the memory of her screams. So it's not, I won't say people use it a lot that way, but it's definitely one of the ways it gets used, okay? Dialogue, this you're going to see in plays, but you might also see it in magazine interviews or podcast transcriptions where they want to make it clear who's talking, but everything is talking. So they don't keep on using quotation marks over and over again. They just put the person's name and then a colon and then the words. So for example, here we've got Piggy number 1. No, you can't come in. Big bad wolf, colon, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow the house down. Same thing here, question versus answer, and they've just put a colon afterwards to introduce the conversation. You can also use it to introduce lists, texts, or tabular material. You would capitalize the first word after the colon only if it's a proper noun or the start of a complete sentence. So I could do a short list, like here's what you need to bring to summer camp, colon, sunglasses, sunscreen, 5 pairs of shorts or pants, 5 t-shirts, 5 pairs of socks, 5 pairs of underwear, 2 pairs of shoes, ones that can get wet, period. Or I could use it to introduce a really long, like a speech. Martin Luther King has a famous speech. And if I wanted to quote it, rather than putting in quotes for that really long period, I could just do a colon, indent it, and then people would understand that this is Martin Luther's speech. Sometimes you might see them add one more cue where they would put it as italicized. And then people know for sure that, okay, that's not the same text as the rest, so therefore it means it's a little bit different. It's not always yet done that way, but it's one way. Sometimes you can use a colon to clarify the titles of books, lectures, and other compositions. So here, you see the one word computer in big letters. Now there's no colon here on the page, but underneath it, there's kind of like a subheading, a history of the information machine. So when you're writing that in a sentence, you would put computer, colon, a history of the information machine. And it kind of conveys, hey, this is the subheading. Oh, okay. Sorry, we have the colons already here where they belong. So instead of looking for where they belong, what are they doing here? She knew he could be there for only one reason, murder. Okay, what's the reason? What are we doing here? This is for emphasis. Hero, I will never give up. Well, here we're introducing dialogue in a play. She found an old journal in the attic. When she opened it up, she read, I had the most wonderful day, and it is all because of Peter. I can't wait to see him again. Well, why are they using the colon? Because they're introducing a bit of text. Her new textbook looked like it would be interesting. A history of modern Canada, colon, the world the wars created. What's the colon doing here? Here's your main title. Here's your subheading. Try my new Halloween craft. To get started, you will need, colon, green and black construction paper, glue, scissors, googly eyes, and some silver glitter. So why is there a colon here? Because we're introducing a list. Semicolons. Semicolon has two general uses. The first, if one or more elements in a series already contain commas, then you may need to use semicolons to separate them. So you'll see this with dates, like it's Monday, February 14th, or you might see it with towns and provinces. So the concert dates this month will be in major cities across Canada. Toronto, Ontario, semicolon, Winnipeg, Manitoba, semicolon, Montreal, Quebec, semicolon, and Regina, Saskatchewan. You don't need the semicolon here because you're finishing, you're using the period. The other one that you see it, and it isn't used this way, I don't think people are familiar with using this, but I think it's one that might be used more often because people often use a comma to separate two sentences, and you can't do that, but you can separate two sentences with a semicolon. Generally, you should only use this if you could use a period. It's a complete sentence, but you want to show that there's a relationship between two complete sentences, like they're on a similar topic or theme. So for example, good grades are integral to student success. A strong support network is also important. So they're both talking about how to succeed in school. Yep, that's good. Hang on. Okay. And for this one, you can see here, Detroit, Michigan, semicolon, Chicago, Illinois, semicolon, Cincinnati, Ohio, no semicolons, we've got a period. Being an Olympian requires total dedication, semicolon. Every moment is scheduled and planned in order to get the most out of every day, period. She looked at her calendar to see what was available. Monday, September 18th, semicolon, Tuesday, October 17th, semicolon, Monday, October 30th, semicolon, and Tuesday, November 14th were all that were left. Now, there's no semicolon here because the list has ended and we're switching back into the main sentence. So it would look odd and it is unnecessary. Okay, so here we're looking at assignment 8. And as I mentioned before, this only can be done if you've actually read chapter 1. So if you've done the other assignments, you should be ready for this. Now, I'm not sure why, but this is definitely an assignment that people have found a little bit confusing. So I'm kind of going to go into detail on it to make sure it's really clear. Basically, they've listed 13 different sentence props where they've given you the beginning of the sentence, and then they've put an ellipse. An ellipse is where you see dot, dot, dot. And the dot, dot, dot is just saying this sentence is unfinished and you need to finish it. Now, they've organized these prompts into three different groups. One is about asking questions, one is about finding the main ideas, and one is about thinking about the texts. Now, it asks you to choose three of the prompts above. Because there's three groups, a lot of people felt like they had to do one from each group, but you don't necessarily have to. You can choose any three prompts as long as you aren't saying the same idea over and over again. So I wouldn't choose the main message is and the text was mainly about because they probably are pretty similar, right? But I could write the most important thing I remember is and clues, words, and features that help me understand the text were, because those are going to be very different answers. The whole thing is worth 9 marks. So each prompt that you answer is worth 3 marks. So for each answer, you're going to want to make sure that you have at least 3 sentences explaining your ideas. Sometimes people just hand me in like one sentence on each prompt, and then basically I give you 3 marks out of 9, which is not a pass. So make sure you write long is how I would put it. So we're going to look at the first category. This is the one about asking questions. Remember yesterday we talked about the ellipse, meaning that the sentence is unfinished and that they want us to finish the sentence. And the overall themes of these types of questions that they're asking is, what can I ask to help me better understand this text? What does the writer mean by? They have left this blank, so you would finish it with something that you found confusing or weird or ambiguous in the story, and then discuss the possible meanings. So, for example, when it says, what does the writer mean by saying that your heart and brain can't run properly if garbage and dirt are loading up your brain? Well, I think the writer is trying to say that sometimes the things that hurt us in the past are acting like dirt clogging up an air filter. It keeps us from running at full speed. We have to find ways to clean out all the past memories that are hurting us or holding us back. So I didn't just write, hey, this part I found confusing. I talked about it. I talked about maybe here's what it could mean. So you don't want to be too literal. You kind of want to, talk on a little bit. Um, I feel like this category is maybe one of the toughest categories because sometimes we just kind of draw a blank when it comes to questions to ask. And let's look at some of the other possibilities they gave us. One was why did blank or why didn't blank. So those are very general. And it's meant to give you lots of leeway, but sometimes it's like, it's so much leeway, I don't know what you mean. So here are some possible examples. Why did Jimmy try to burn the building down? Why didn't anyone else get in trouble for the arson and break-ins? Why did Jimmy get involved with drugs? So there are all sorts of questions you can ask in these categories, but you need to be prepared to explore and discuss the possible answers as well. So why did anyone get involved else in trouble for the arson and the break-ins? Well, the reason is because, right, it does state in the book that one. Another question they've got is, what have I learned? This can be a tricky one with a novel. I honestly think it's a little bit better suited to nonfiction material, although you're welcome to use it. So an example for nonfiction would be, what have I learned about writing resumes? And then you would answer the question. But I have seen people use it like, well, what have I learned about Jimmy in this chapter? And that's totally fine because then you could talk about Jimmy. Or what have I learned about this novel? What have I learned about Green Star Lake? You can phrase it however you want. So you can definitely adapt it to fictional reading material. Now, I wonder is one of those funny prompts. And it's basically a different way of asking a question and like saying, like, I was thinking about this or I thought this was weird. It just means that you've got a question in your mind. Now, if when you were reading, you didn't have any questions, and I know that happens to some people, it's okay to skip these prompts, right? Nothing bad happens. I'm not looking that you have to answer one of these. It is totally fine to skip these if you find these really tricky, okay? Sometimes we might wonder why characters are making certain choices or doing certain things or why they're saying certain things. So an example might be, I wonder why Gary keeps trying to get Jimmy into trouble. So I've made the question, but that's not enough. I need to kind of provide an answer too. And that's maybe the part that is confusing to people. So here's my answer. Well, maybe he doesn't realize that he's causing Jimmy to get into trouble. But since Jimmy just got out of juvie, how does he not notice? Does he just not care about Jimmy getting into trouble? Or maybe he's so used to getting into trouble that he doesn't even realize there's any other way to live. So remember, you can finish the I wonder prompt with any question you want to. Like I said, if you find this one too hard, don't choose it. Just pick a prompt that you like better. You've got 13 choices. You don't have to pick the hardest ones. Okay, so here is an example of two different versions where I'm doing a I wonder. And which version do you think answers the question better? And I'm going to base my questions off the Avengers movie. I don't want to give everything away by using our novel. So I wonder why Natalie, aka the Black Widow, always acts pretty but dumb when she is talking to men. Maybe that is how she was trained to be a secret agent. So this is how she automatically acts. Or maybe she just finds it works really well because men often underestimate pretty women. Possibly she finds it funny to trick them by acting dumb when she is actually really smart. So that's my one answer. Over here, I've got, I wonder why Loki is always trying to hurt others. It's wrong to hurt others, even if they don't like you. I would never do that. Loki should be nice instead. Maybe people would like him better then. Then he could be friends with his brother Thor, and maybe he could even be one of the Avengers. So the thing with these two, this one here talking about Natalie, the question I've asked is, why does she always act pretty but dumb? And I spend the whole time answering that question. I stay on topic. This one is not so strong. Instead of talking about reasons why Loki is hurting others, I just start saying he shouldn't do it and how he should act instead, which unfortunately means I've gotten off topic. So I haven't really answered my own question. So this is better, not because I wrote more, but because I stayed on topic and I answered my own question. So that's something to think about as you're working. Okay, new category. Here we're in the main ideas category. And these I think are a little bit easier to answer. The big thing is remember to answer long. Don't just give me one sentence. This is the category where the idea of rap rock that they looked at yesterday can be useful. Remember, rap rock is the acronym for restate the question, answer the question, prove it from the text, relate it to yourself, the world, and other books, opinion on what happened, and conclude your answer. So I'm going to look at the sentence props and then we're going to try one and I'll show you what I mean. So one is the most important thing I remember about this text is the main message is the text was mainly about clues, words, and features that helped me understand the text were, and you would fill in those blanks or, pick one and fill in the blank. So let's put this into action. I'm going to use a movie for an example. Let's say the Barbie one. So down here, I've got my rap rock, so I remember what I'm doing, and I color coded it. So if this is in red and you see a sentence in red, that's because that part is doing that function. So for restating, restate is where you kind of turn the question about and turn it into the beginning of your answer. So the text was mainly about, my answer says, how Barbie discovers that the real world is not like the Barbie world. Then proving it. When you're proving it, it means that you're going to be using examples from the story to support your answer. In the Barbie world, the women control everything, and the boy dolls just seem to hang around wanting their attention. In the real world, it seems like the men still run everything, and the women seem to feel like second-class citizens. Then Ken decides to bring the patriarchy back to the Barbie world so he and his friends can run things there. Now I'm going on to the part where I relate it to things. I felt like this movie expressed a point of view about the world That used to be true, but is less true these days. And it had a very derogatory view of men that I don't share. And then opinion. I didn't really like the movie because I felt like it didn't make a lot of sense and didn't explain things very well. And then you make a concluding statement. Overall, I felt like the movie was not very well done. And I apologize in advance if you loved the Barbie movie. It was not my favorite. But that's an example of how I can write long. You don't have to write it as long as this, but you do need to find ways to make sure it's not a one sentence answer and that you're not just saying the same thing over and over again. So this one, the prompt is clues, words, and features that helped me understand the text were. Now, I feel like this one is really good if you were reading like a textbook or any kind of book that had a mixture of pictures, captions, diagrams. So I don't know how much help it is for Jimmy Comes Home because there really isn't a lot of that. But here is an example if you were going to use it. Um, Features might include things like chapter headings, subheadings, sidebars, bolded text, italicized text, dialogue, glossary, diagrams, or pictures. These features may help you understand definitions of words or show you what words are a priority. They might show you flashbacks, main theme or ideas, important details, a visualization of a place, event, person, or process. Clues might refer to text that contains important information to understand the theme or message of the novel. These clues might be contained in dialogue or descriptive text or crucial events. And sometimes keywords might summarize or suggest a theme. For example, sometimes the chapter title in a fiction novel might give you an idea what the theme is going to be about. Or some novels have like a little quote at the top of a chapter that's also kind of trying to get you to think about the ideas in that chapter. So if you were using that prompt, you could break it down into separate sentences or pick one part that's really important. Some features that helped me understand this text were, some clues that helped me understand this text were, some words that helped me understand this text were. So again, I think this is a tough one, but if you are feeling drawn to it, by all means use it. So here is, oh, I don't think that kind of relates to that one. I'm going to come back to that. This is our third category. This one is thinking about the text. These prompts are very reflective. They want you to think about the overall meaning of the text. So they're giving us general ideas of prompts. They're not all 100% appropriate to use when looking at the first chapter of a novel. Some of these might work better at the end of a novel. So, like the message of the text, for example, that's kind of easier to understand once you've read the whole book. It's kind of tricky to decide that one right at the very first chapter, but you could use it. Okay. So they talk about theme at one point, but I don't know if what theme is really clear. Theme and message are basically the same idea. Theme is the main or central idea in a literary work. It is the unifying element of a story. A theme is not a summary of the characters or a summary of the events. It's the controlling idea or like the central insight of the story. A theme does not have to be a moral. So, for example, you could ask yourself, what does this story reveal? Not what does it teach? What is the story's central purpose? What view of life does it support? Or what insight to life does it reveal? The theme is comprised or composed of both a topic and then a statement about the topic. To create a theme, you have to have that extra statement. So, for example, if I just said the topic is youth, that's not enough information. But if I was saying Joseph Conrad's novel Youth is about the enthusiasm of new youth, still I'm kind of explaining the topic, but I'm not going into the real theme. The theme would be the enthusiasm of youth lends glamour and romance to hardship, danger, and calamity in Joseph Conrad's youth. Now, having said that, sometimes when people are talking about certain themes that are very common, they may just refer to them in very general terms. But because these questions are specifically asking you to write long, I wouldn't want you to do that, right? Here are some examples of themes that come up over and over again, though, in all sorts of writing: love and death, appearance versus reality, journey of self-discovery, loss of innocence or coming of age, journey or quest, Oedipus complex, individual versus society, fate. So it's not just the plot, like the events, but what the plot and the characters' choices show us about the world or ourselves. So if we were talking about Toy Story, sorry, I could say, well, it's about these toys, and there's a new toy that comes in, and they have a fight and kind of an argument, but then kind of eventually they become friends. I'm telling you the plot. I'm not telling you the message or the theme. The theme of Toy Story is how enemies working together, which is like Buzz and the cowboy whose name I'm quite forgetting, working together against a common foe, that evil boy, can develop friendship and understanding to achieve victory. So I would want to expand on this. This is still not enough. That's the beginning of a reply, okay? Purpose. The purpose of this text. Purpose is kind of a funny word. It has multiple meanings. It could be interpreted in different ways. So all writing has one of three overall purposes. And the three main purposes are to entertain people, to inform people, or to persuade people. Some writing might combine some of those goals, though. For example, a fictional novel that's set in medieval times might have as its primary purpose to entertain us with a murder mystery, but it might have a secondary purpose of informing us about the everyday life of women in the 12th century in England. So that's kind of it's a hard one, but I think it's a useful one, an important one. Nonfiction often has the overriding purpose of informing us, but it may have a really specific purpose as well. So a magazine article about fashion's use of sweatshops in India might be informing us of shady business practices in common retailers, but it may also be hoping to persuade us to buy clothes from more reputable fashion brands. So see, I'm not just saying inform or persuade. I'm saying, what are they trying to inform you about? What are they trying to persuade you about? I'm going into detail. A textbook about biology may have the purpose of informing students about the fundamentals of biology at a university level so that they can go into science fields with competent and accurate knowledge and abilities. So again, more detail. Prompt. These ideas relate to blank because blank. Now, this is a great way to reflect on nonfiction. I'm going to talk about that first because it's easiest, but you can also use it in fiction. An article on deceptive practices in the food industry might be examined with this prompt. For example, the ideas in this article relate to how nutritional labels on food can be misleading because retailers can set their own serving sizes that don't reflect the actual amounts people really eat. So sometimes you'll see that where it'll be like, the serving size is 1 ounce, and you measure it out and look at it, and normally you would eat 6 ounces, and you're like, oh, well, I'm seeing 100 calories, but I would normally actually eat 600 calories. It's deceptive because there isn't necessarily specified serving sizes. It can be a little bit harder to use in fiction, but it does work with ideas. So what are some of the ideas that are present in chapter 1? Jimmy is starting a new life. He feels some doubt about how this is work. He isn't sure if people really want him back. So those are all ideas that are occurring. How do they relate to what? To yourself, to real life, to other books you've read? So kind of what connections does it have? Connections might be the big word there. So if you feel like you could use this, feel free. Again, I think it's one of the tougher ones, but that doesn't mean you can't use it. You totally can. This is a really interesting one. It talks about this text may be biased because blank, blank, blank. What does bias mean? Well, the Collins Dictionary defines bias as a tendency to prefer one person or thing to another and to favor that person or thing. Now, it kind of suggests there's an unreasonable and unfair preference, but it's not always unfair. In this case, that's probably what we're looking for, though. It can be a really great prompt if you want to discuss issues like stereotypes about race, gender, class, occupations, sex. Oops, hang on. There we go. I have gender twice for some reason. Okay. Prejudices of any kind. Prejudices is bigger than just stereotypes. So maybe the main character thinks all lawyers are evil because of some events in their past, and they're learning how to overcome that prejudice. Conflict of interest issues. So let's say a judge is writing an opinion piece about how judges should have more autonomy or freedom over sentencing criminals. Well, he's a judge. They may have some bias in their point of view. By the same token, a criminal writing on the same topic might have some bias as well. Differing values. The writer might feel the most important part of an issue is that a crime was committed, but maybe you feel that the most important part is what led the person to do that crime. Any kind of social justice issues. So if you were using this prompt, you would want to explain what in the text makes you feel that it's biased. Is it a character's actions? Is it their words or thinking? Is it the choice of topics or events the writer is using? Is it things that should be mentioned or discussed that haven't been? So you don't want to just say it's biased. You'd want to tell me why you think it's biased, right? What is wrong with it? Okay, so here's an example of the kind of bias I'm talking about. There's a popular TV show called Grey's Anatomy, and one of the main characters is Miranda Bailey. She is smart, funny, sarcastic, and the current chief of surgery at the hospital when this episode happened. At one point, she becomes convinced that she is having a heart attack, and she goes to a nearby hospital, not her own, in order to deal with her diagnosis privately. And once there, she has to practically beg them to test her because she doesn't seem to be exhibiting the typical symptoms of a heart attack. But they're looking at typical men's symptoms rather than women's. So then she insists on a second test, which is called a cardiac stress test, before leaving the hospital. And the doctor she's talking to appears to agree, but the next doctor that shows up is actually a psychiatrist who's trying to get her to discuss all her emotional problems. And he's obviously of the belief that she's just stressed out from such an important job as being chief of surgery, kind of implying that it's too much for a mere woman. And then he tries to discuss her calming down, right? Because implying she's just a hysterical woman. And it isn't until Miranda finally passes out unconscious on the floor that they finally realize she's right. She is actually having a heart attack. But the doctor she consulted had so much bias that he simply could not perceive what was actually happening. His bias affected his abilities. So that is like one example of how you could discuss bias. One of the other prompts is very connected to the concept of bias, and it says this text doesn't deal with blank. Sometimes a story or a text can focus so heavily on one viewpoint that it distorts the overall picture of a situation by not even discussing certain issues or certain situations at all. It isn't that it's untruthful, but it is incomplete and can give a false picture. So, for example, if you're reading a story about colonial settlers, it may suggest they're going into an unpopulated wilderness. But they don't discuss the fact that, in fact, it used to be populated with First Nations people that may have been driven out or even killed. So that creates a false picture of what's happening in that story. Some other examples might include things like a story that focuses on a wife killing her husband, but doesn't mention that she tried repeatedly to report spousal abuse, but was dismissed or ignored by the police over several years. A story about a new golf course opening that doesn't mention that the land was appropriated from First Nations people. A story about increased crime stats in an urban center that doesn't mention that welfare funding was recently cut. So those are all examples where if you're reading a story, you may go, hey, you know, they're just not discussing this part of the story. And I'm concerned about the fact that they're not discussing it because I think that we would get a clearer picture. So when you're reading this novel, you may feel that too. And in this case, chapter 1, maybe there's things that you feel like should have been discussed that aren't being discussed in that chapter. Here's an example from a discussion forum, and they're talking about Jane Austen's books. She's kind of a writer from several hundred years ago in England, writing about marriage and its effects on women and how the need to get married kind of affects everything. Um, if you look at the historical romance type of literature out there, he means historical as in written a long time ago. You see the entire world of these people consists of the privileged classes. Less well-born people often just don't even exist in their plots. If you think about it, the bias is staggering. The entire premise of these books is that the norm is the highly artificial world of the upper 1000. It is so biased, it isn't even biased against the lower classes. Their existence is just totally ignored. I still like Jan's books, but if you want a better view, read Catherine Cookson. They are set later, but they are so much better to read than Jan, and that's by Peter Bellis, who was talking on Quora. This is a good example of discussing what's been left out. Most of Jane Austen's books deal with women of the upper class or formerly upper class trying to survive in a world in which the only perceived choice of career for a lady of the upper class is to make a good marriage. And her novel did a really great job of showing the sexism that existed in the upper classes and how a good or bad marriage could absolutely break or make an upper class woman, which that was not a topic being discussed at all in those days. In fact, there weren't many women who were writing openly. I believe that they actually had to use male names because people wouldn't have bought books from females. So this is an important part. However, the books don't really look at the lives of women in the lower or even the middle classes. It's probably not surprising because the person who wrote it was a lady of the upper class and she simply wrote about the world that she knew. It doesn't make her books bad, but it can leave you with the unconscious idea that that was how all men and women lived in those times, rather than a very small percentage of women from one country. So, talking about what's been left out or isn't being discussed is a totally valid way of discussing any kind of story. Okay, so here's an example of discussing the message of a text. The message of this text, The Avengers, is that people are more powerful when we respect each other and work as a team. Each one of the Avengers has brains and strengths. Each one of them is very successful at being a superhero. But when they first are working together, they don't really respect each other's talents or abilities. They are used to being the most powerful person in the room, and they don't really look to see what other people might contribute to a situation. But once they begin to respect each other more and work together, they are far more effective at fighting their battles. So that's one possibility. Here's the second possibility. The message of this text, The Avengers, is that if you are strong, it is important to defend others. Helping others is really important. Like Iron Man is really strong. He could act all evil and try to destroy everything, but he doesn't. He helps others with his iron suit instead. Loki is strong. He could be helping others, but instead he just tries to hurt people for no reason. I was glad when they defeated him. So, which one is stronger and why? So, I'm going to talk here about some of the problems in this one, okay? One of the problems here is the big one is main problem. The problem is that he doesn't stay on topic. So, when he starts talking about, I was glad they defeated him and Loki doesn't help people, he's kind of getting off his own topic. Okay. Another problem would be the tone, right? When he's going like Iron Man is really strong, it's kind of a very casual way. We would talk that way, but we wouldn't usually read that way. The other thing is there's a few incomplete sentences here. So hang on a second. This one is a little better because the tone is more appropriate. It stays on topic. I will also say it uses a variety of sentence types. It is also a little bit longer, which I do tend to look for. If something's really short, you just don't have enough room to say what you want to say. Whereas I'm not looking for like, crazy long, but sometimes if you go that extra sentence or two, you have a little more space to write your ideas down. Okay. Remember that you only have to pick 3 prompts. If you find yourself confused by any one prompt, don't choose it. If you find one really easy, pick that one instead. As long as you aren't saying the same thing, you can pick 2 prompts from the same category. Now, some prompts in a category are very similar and you just end up repeating yourself, so don't do that. But sometimes the prompts have very different focus. Remember that each prompt in your answer, you should have at least 3 sentences. Use the RAPROC method if it helps you. If it just confuses you, then don't worry about it. Just make sure to write 3 interesting, well thought out sentences on the prompt that don't repeat themselves over and over. Tomorrow, we're going to look at assignment number 10, which is a journal prompt. It is the first journal that has multiple paragraphs, which can make it a little bit tricky. Try to take a few minutes to look at it before we discuss it tomorrow, so that if you have any questions, you can address them then. This is my little meme here I grabbed from somewhere. You can't read that entire book in a day. Don't believe me, just watch. Okay, don't read ahead of chapter 1 though, because some of the assignments that come up need you to make predictions. And I know I've had a few students tell me, oh, I just got started and I've read the entire book. It's like, oh no, it's going to make it harder to do some of the assignments if you read too far ahead. So I'm asking you not to, if you could please do that. I know that's kind of hard. Okay. I wanted to tackle this because this is a really great example in real life of a reporter, and she's calling out the bias in some news coverage, right? And I think until she pointed it out, it wasn't really being noticed. Once she pointed it out, I think more people began to notice and realize what was happening and that there was some stereotypes and racist beliefs and things. But until she called it out, it really was passing by unnoticed. And I think it really changed things about how people discussed the Ukrainian war. So I wanted to kind of grab this because I thought it was really interesting when I first stumbled across it. And it kind of relates to what we're talking about.
You've seen the situation in Ukraine. You've seen how the world is responding. Now let me show you how the world is covering this invasion. I'm talking about the media, especially Western channels. How are they covering Russia's invasion? With blatant racism. Let me say something at the outset. As journalists, we do not filter hardships and pain. We do not see caste, color, or gender. And we have stuck by this principle. When the Taliban stormed Kabul, we stood with Afghans. When Ethiopia attacked its own people, we questioned them. When unarmed black teenagers were gunned down in the US, we joined the outrage. Today, we are doing the same. We see the plight of the Ukrainian people, and we have reported on their hardships. But what about the Western media? They too are reporting on the crisis, on the war, on the refugees. But they do not see hardships. They only see race, the color of your skin, the color of your hair. Let me show you exhibit number 1. This exchange happened on the BBC, the so-called guardian of unbiased reportage. Listen to how their panel describes the refugees from Ukraine.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed.
People with blue eyes and blonde hair. That is why the so-called expert on the BBC is emotional, not because the people are homeless, not because their country is being invaded, but because their hair is blonde. On social media, a lot of people are defending the BBC. They say it's a guest, not their anchor. Let me take you back to September last year. Another guest was speaking on the very same channel, South Asian expert Christine Fair. She called out Pakistan's links with the Taliban. Do you remember what the BBC presenter did? She shut her down. She said it was violating the channel's unbiased coverage. So exposing terror links is a violation. Blatant racism and white supremacy is fine. Gold standard indeed. Now for exhibit number 2, NBC News from the US. Listen to this.
These are not refugees from Syria. These are Christians, they're white, they're
very similar to us. How so? Because the Syrian refugees are Muslims, their skin is darker, their hair is not blonde. So Europe does not want them. And remember, this is not being said at some white supremacy cult. This is happening on live television. Exhibit number 3, CBS News, another American broadcaster. Their reporter is appalled by the war, not because there is death and destruction, but because it is happening in Europe.
Like Iraq or Afghanistan, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
So Iraq and Afghanistan are uncivilized countries. Their people are uncultured. Their regimes are irresponsible. So they deserve war. They deserve hundreds of bombs and years of occupation. What about Ukraine? According to CBS, no. Ukraine does not deserve war or hardships because Ukraine is civilized. And now for the final exhibit. This one is not from the West. It is from Al Jazeera in Qatar. This anchor simply cannot comprehend the idea of European refugees.
What's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
That reporter is confused about the refugees. They look middle class, they look like Europeans. How is something so bad happening to them? Well, this is what systemic racism looks like. Do you remember the 2015 refugee crisis? Around 1.3 million people sought asylum in Europe. Most of them were from Syria, Afghanistan and Nigeria. Do you remember how the West reacted? They shut their borders, they herded the refugees like cattle, and they branded them as terrorists. Back then, Western reportage was quite different. Let me show you what the BBC did. They prepared 7 charts depicting the refugee crisis. Let's focus on chart number 5. Which European countries are most affected? Now remember, this war was in West Asia. The bombs were dropping on West Asia, but this was the BBC's big concern. Which European countries are most affected? Now just to be clear, we welcome what Europe is doing to host Ukrainian refugees. They deserve all the help. Our question is, why just Ukraine? Ukraine is not a member of the European Union. It is not part of NATO. So what explains this level of assistance? Racism. You see, Ukrainians are Europeans. Hence, they get the red carpet. But Africans and Asians get border crackdowns and refugee camps. Western media is part of the problem, I have to say. They reflect the public mentality, their sense of European supremacy. And the problem is, governments are not doing anything to help. In fact, they're adding fuel to this fire. Let me show you what Bulgaria's Prime Minister said about refugees. I'm quoting. These people are intelligent. They're educated people. This is not the refugee wave we have been used to. People we were not sure about their identity. People with unclear pasts who could have been even terrorists. That was a European head of state. He is openly calling West Asian refugees terrorists. If this does not expose Western hypocrisy, nothing does. They invaded Asian and African countries. They waged war. They committed war crimes. And when the people fled, they shut their borders. What does this tell you? That refugees were never the problem. That money or borders were not the issue. The issue was race. Think about it. WION is now available.
I just wanted to show that. I just wanted to show that because I thought she just did a really good job of discussing specific things that were causing her to feel that people were racist. So that's the kind of thing we're looking for, rather than just being kind of general and saying this is wrong, being specific. And I think that, again, she really, and her, her news outlet really changed the discussion about the Ukrainian refugee situation and how it relates or connects to refugee situations from other countries. So anyways, assignment number 8 is an interesting assignment. Pick the parts you like. If you get really stuck, by all means, feel free to call me. I'd be happy to talk about it to anybody. Thank you so much for showing up today. Does anyone have any questions while we still have a bit of time? No? Okay, well then I will talk to you guys tomorrow, and I hope you have a good evening.